I didn't get cast that much. I didn't get any leading roles in undergrad until my super senior semester. And I kind of just learned from that I wasn't castable, but I loved the work. So I committed to doing work for these means. So it just kind of, it really blows my mind that in this full circle way, my first big studio production is really kind of worked in the same way.
It's an audience of actors, so I have to start with the audition process. You met with Ellen Lewis. Tell us, how did it go?
Yeah, Ellen was wonderful. This was in October 2019. I went in, and it was a very candid conversation where she told me how high interest was. She, because she's sensitive to actors, kind of warned me of, like, I don't know, maybe some of the things I might hear elsewhere that would put me in my head about it or make me feel not confident about it. I mean, one thing that actually gave me quite a bit of confidence in the film is she did tell me that they were going to do a locals casting call in Osage Nation before they formally auditioned actors. So it was nice that she brought me in and let me know that interest level was high, because that also gives you the benefit of really diving into like the character research and turning up all the extra things that maybe just the first read of the book, which I had already done at that point, didn't turn up. And being a Native actor, I was discovered because a film that was being made locally decided to cast locally rather than pulling talent from LA to appease producers. And I was grateful for that. So it gave me a lot of confidence that the film was trying to do it in the right way from the get-go, which is always kind of a little bit nerve-wracking as a Native actor. And it was the first really big studio film that I'd been called into so specifically. So then after the locals casting process had happened, which had turned up actors who played very key Osage historical roles in it outside of the sisters, and actually really shaped the film after that. I did my first sides read. I did a self-tape and then was brought back in for notes. And I remember back then, actors in here, you kind of know when you're getting dummy sides. I had that moment where I was like, God, I hope these are dummy sides, because they were very well written, but it was a 3-page heavy dialogue scene between Molly and Ernest, where Molly had long monologues where she kind of names all of her family in one go. You get like a sense of her and Ernest's relationship in one interaction, and it felt like a very tertiary character to me. And it was also not the Molly that I had read in the book. It was not the Molly that I had felt thinking about just who Native women at that point in history were, just stories about my own grandmother, or great-grandmother, and I'm named after my great-grandmother Lily, who would have been a contemporary of Molly. They were only 10 years apart in age. So I remember, you guys also know what it feels like when you do an audition and you do every possible thing you can, but you just don't feel like you have it.
You had read the book. I don't think it's common to read the whole book before your first audition.
I mean, I read it and I audiobooked it. So that was I need both. It covered all bases. Like when I needed to be on the train, just like I listened to a lot of the book on the subway, read it as fast as you can, as much as you can. And it's funny because the way that I ended up reading the book is the way that I feel like the rewrite had happened, because after I got called back in for the notes and then the reread with Ellen, COVID happened. And unbeknownst to me, but so gratefully, the whole film got gutted and redone. Leo didn't want to play the FBI Tom White, because when I auditioned, he was slated for Tom White. And it was funny because I even remember reading the sides, imagining Jesse Plemons as Ernest. So it was kind of cool when that kind of flipped eventually. Yeah, when I got the new sides almost a year later, suddenly they were actionable in the way that I understood Molly could be, and in the way that I understand what I'm able to do on stage and what I'm able to do on screen. It's like I know I've got kind of tricks for both, and I could see how I could like unpack my screen acting toolbox into these new sides, and also just felt like a more fully developed character. It's like, okay, this is a scene that feels like a flavor of what their relationship is going to be, so that told me that she was going to be main character, and that completely changed the audition process, which at that point just ended up being reading directly with Marty once. And then that led to a meeting with Marty and Leo that, went over about an hour. We were scheduled for an hour, but we just talked the whole time. Had my sides next to me the whole time, just expecting that this is also going to be the chem read. And then a couple weeks passes, Leo's shooting Don't Look Up and is saying, yeah, let's get back into this and read sides and like really test this out. So in my head, I'm like, okay, we're going to do a chem read. So when the next call came in on December 1st, 2020, I was expecting that it was scheduling that, but it was the offer, because Marty was just so clear that, he saw what he needed. And the best part of it all, and stop me if you've already heard this because I say it a lot, but December 1st, when I got the offer, turns out was Molly Burkhart's birthday. By no one's design. Maybe Molly's design.
Seems that way. So I want to talk to you a little bit about research. And I read that Martin had said that you met with the Osage and came to him with questions and ideas. So I'm wondering what you learned from the Osage community in your research, which you passed to Martin, hoping that he would use it, and then how did he use what you gave him?
I mean, Marty was just open to the whole process. Anytime someone who was Osage had something to say, it would usually change the script. And I went a little extracurricular. Like, I really, really praise Sekelia for the fact that they sent producers out a year ahead of when any talent or anybody else from production arrived, just to build relationships with community. So when I got there, people were familiar with the presence that we were bringing into the community. And there were a lot of meetings set up, and I met a lot of new people. But I had Osage friends just from being in the community. It's this kind of dual thing, like when somebody's like finds out you're Native, they're like, oh, do you know this person? And then it's like you're waiting to be like, oh my God, we don't all know each other. And then they'll say the person and you're like, oh yeah, I do know them. It's just a joke in Indian country. It's like 2 degrees of separation instead of 7. But yeah, I had Osage friends from work prior that I got in touch with, and one particularly, Wilson Pipestem, is a brilliant lawyer who's done a lot of work for, a lot of different aspects of Indian country. I got to know him because of his work with the Violence Against Women Act and getting the Native provisions re-signed on those. There was a play reading that went along with that, but anyways, Wilson shared stories of his grandmother Rose, which was so valuable because in talking with Wilson, I was able to give myself permission to lean into a lot of the instincts I had from stories of my grandmother Lily. Both Native women from about the same time. Rose would have been about the same age as Grandma Lil. But Osage and Blackfeet are different. There's 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States and several hundred others that are not federally recognized, either state or self-recognized. But we have different languages, we have different histories. It's like we're very diverse. Washington State alone has more tribal nations than Europe has countries. So the difference, it was a big thing. I was really trying hard not to apply a Blackfeet perspective to Osage history, but being the fact that Rose Pipestem was a traditional Osage woman and very Catholic, and Grandma Lily was the same. She was very Catholic and very Native, spoke her language. The more I visited with Wilson, the more I just kept hearing stories that sounded like Grandma Lily. So that was nice. But then Wilson also offered these stories that Grandma Rose had, and the credits that you just watched, it really moved me the first time that I saw the film that they chose the rain, kind of hearkening back to that moment where Molly puts the blanket on and like slows things down and, sits and, explains how powerful the storm is. That was what Rose used to do. That scene had originally ended in the script with Molly and Ernest basically taking whiskey shots together, and Ernest and Molly drinking Ernest under the table. The community said that wouldn't have been Molly. That maybe would have been Anna, but it wouldn't have been Molly. So Wilson, with his understanding of how the community knew Molly, offered this story from his grandma Rose, and he offered it to Marty directly too, which was, giving both Marty and Wilson and everybody else credit. We offered what we could as actors when we'd pick these things up. But yeah, Wilson told that story, and Marty immediately changed that scene. And then I think it's just really lovely after you've been so bowled over by this film and so, just beaten down by this storm. You have a moment to just kind of sit and reflect on it. And yeah, that rain at the end.
I mean, it is intense. There's so much death and loss and cruelty. But I want to come back. You talked about the stage, and you talked about a play reading with Wilson about the murdered and missing women. And for people, I don't know if everybody knows, I mean, you're a veteran of the Oregon Shakespeare Company and Yale Rep. You are a theater actress. So it makes complete sense to me that you, as an actress, you have this background in theater and education, and that you are using your platform and the work that you do and the characters that you're building. I mean, Molly is so still and grounded, to inform people. It is a form of activism.
Thank you. Yeah. When I was an undergrad, I learned about Augusto Boal in Theater of the Oppressed, which was kind of grown from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is, if an oppressed population owns the means, not the means of their own production, but their own educational system and their own way of learning and understanding the world, then they can shape it better. So TO, Theater of the Oppressed, branched from the same things, and ironically, a lot of it borrowed from indigenous gameplay. Like TO exercises are very based on Augusto Boal, spending a lot of time in indigenous communities in Brazil. And what's kind of funny is he started his workout with, he admitted this later, maybe didn't say it explicitly, but almost a savior complex, because TO originated as bringing Portuguese language to remote Brazilian, Amazonian indigenous people with good intent, so that they could kind of understand some of the things that they were being handed, like this process of treaty making we have in the States and Canada. It's like these deals that Brazilian, Amazonian people were getting into without really speaking the language proficiently. But when he was there, he realized very quickly that he was there essentially kind of doing colonizers' work, and that people had their own stories to share. And that really became clear when they were staging these scenes of oppression that were the actors' perception of what these folks were going through, these rural indigenous folks. And it was just, the people in the audience didn't feel represented. So that's when the fourth wall was dissolved. It became spectator. And then the audience started telling the actors on stage what their experience was. And then at that point, the actors are like, please come up and show us. So Theater of the Oppressed has to do with people who share, marginalized folks who share a common oppression, coming together, talking about which stories they want to tackle, and doing so in a way where, we're all artists for a reason. The realities that we create in these moments can really have wide ramification. If you're people who are told you don't have a voice, your story doesn't matter, when you have complete charge of that on stage, and you also can direct actors to improvise different outcomes, you can see a different reality imagined, and then you start imagining how you could make that happen in the real world. So that was the foundation of where I thought my life's work in acting and theater was going to take me. Because in undergrad, even though I did really well in classwork, I felt very confident in like my ability to break down a scene, to form a character, to like, basically understand the assignment. I didn't get cast that much. I didn't get any leading roles in undergrad until my super senior semester. And I kind of just learned from that I wasn't castable, but I loved the work. So I committed to doing work for these means. So it just kind of, it really blows my mind that in this full circle way, my first big studio production is really kind of worked in the same way. Marty as a filmmaker just understands the work is better when you're allowing the world that you're shooting to shape it and to tell you what it is, instead of you coming in with an idea or like, coming in with this great gift of telling people like, this is how we see you. It's like, no, we're going to tell you how we are and you're going to show us that. So it was, it's pretty remarkable.
You talk about improvising. We know that Leonardo DiCaprio is a master improviser. And I've seen him credit you entirely with this it's really the first scene where we get to understand the relationship between the two of you. And he says that it was your idea to come up with this translation where you call him a coyote and he's the handsome devil. Mm-hmm. That's high praise, I think, from Leonardo DiCaprio.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God. And his improvs are so funny. There's some scenes in the film that I still haven't seen, because when it comes up, I just remember what it was like shooting it, and I just laugh too hard. But yeah, Leo's a brilliant improviser, and he and I found a natural rhythm with that so quickly. I can't imagine how much Thelma didn't include in the film, because I remember just how much we would just keep going. Yeah, that was wonderful. Like the discovery of Shomikasi, coyote, came from my language teacher, Chris Cote. And I had two. Chris, I always say, laid the foundation for me, and then Janice Carpenter, who taught me women's dialect, because even within this language that I don't speak and is very, very different than any tribal language that I'm comfortable speaking, there's even different dialects between genders. So when I had an Osage woman teaching me how to say it, she helped me put the window dressings on. But Chris Cote in our early lessons was also giving me stories and helping me like understand Osage worldview, because I told him that early on. It's like I don't want to put a Blackfeet tint on an Osage character. So like I'm just here to learn. But one thing that we had in common, I was raised hearing trickster stories, and Chris would share trickster stories with me because he teaches his students. He will tell them a trickster story because a lot of times, especially when you're telling them to kids, they're really funny and they're entertaining. It's a little bit Looney Tunes-ish, like Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, I guess you can maybe argue. It's kind of how they sound. But he was also illustrating just how animated Osage language is, which is something he and I talked about, both being of the same generation, that films depict us as being so stoic, but we know how like boisterous and funny we are. So he would tell me these trickster stories in Osage language first, so I could see how animated the language was when you speak it, which ultimately is where I found Molly most. And at her most comfortable, obviously, would be in her first language, but it's when she's able to be most expressive. And that scene was definitely the one with the sisters, too. But when Chris told me the Shomikasi story, this coyote story, we vetted it heavily because a lot of these stories are not for outsiders, but this one was one that was okay. It's been published and it's shared with outsiders quite a bit. But I immediately drew it to my own tribal trickster stories I was raised with, and then suddenly I found Molly's blind spot for Ernest to hide in. That when she calls him Coyote, she's not just calling him the animal, she's calling him this trickster figure. Coyote is in Osage oral tradition. They have many trickster figures, some are more sinister. Coyote, still getting used to that, coyote is how we say it in Montana. Anyway, he's like the fop, he's the one who's always, hedonistic, fun-loving, self-serving, makes a party during the night and sleeps all day, as, Ernest admits in that. It's like immediately. But it was always very self-serving and very like charming. But in these stories, when you hear them as a kid, it's really funny. So like immediately Molly had his number. And because you like, that also changed what the whole arc of the story was for me. And Marty and I, just, the other night at National Board of Review, somebody called it a Western, and Marty looked at me again, he's like, God, the Western thing again, we can't escape that. Marty and I are both particularly hesitant to label this film a Western. To me, it's a tragedy, but what it really became for me is a trickster story. Because these stories, even though when you're a kid they're funny, as you age and you think about them and you age with these stories, you really hear the cautionary tales within. Tricksters are creators in the sense that they, in our oral tradition, shape the entire world. So when I understood the arc as being a trickster narrative and understood Ernest as being a trickster, it was so vital that Molly kind of have her finger on his pulse a bit, like have his number, so to say, because then at that point you don't really think they're capable of it. And it also etched her out as a fixture that you hear in oral tradition in these trickster stories as the one who is taken advantage of, the one who is burned, the one who
But it is quite lovely in the beginning, and you reference that scene where I think the audience immediately think, as soon as you buy him a hat, and which is a language of love, it's like, oh no, she's inviting him in, she's flirting with disaster. And that scene is so interesting because of the power dynamic, because we understand, because we hear you ask the question and we hear his answers. And so can you talk a little bit about playing that scene, because she gets the whiskey, and just how you played with the dynamics during that scene to set us up for the disaster to come.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of all in that scene. And I love how much that scene is mirrored for the rest of the film. It kind of packed everything. If you're going to play Molly with the agency that she deserves, you have to give her those blind spots, and you have to establish that in that first meeting. But also, another big reference point outside of just the intense, and always, you always give the Osage voice the first priority when you're doing this. But the other big reference that we had done, or that we had crafted, was Marty had brought up The Heiress, William Wyler's film The Heiress with Olivia de Havilland. And there were a lot of moments that we referenced in that film. But what I saw when I watched that film is, I believe her name's Catherine. She was raised, the idea of being a status, wealthy woman that somebody, Montgomery Clift's character and then Leo's character, would want for her money. And that Olivia de Havilland was told, her father told her in the first few scenes, you're plain, that you're going to be difficult to wed, to wed out. So her sense of self was very diminished, which allowed somebody like Montgomery Clift's character to come in and sweep her off her feet and to really manipulate her. That was not an Osage woman. In Osage world, or in Osage society, Osage are, not to throw many too anthropological terms around, but are matrilocal people. Women own everything. So, and that's age old. It's women own the home, women own everything tangible, women have say over everything basically that you can touch, So when wealth came into it, naturally, women are the ones who, in Osage view, had say over how money was spent. This guardianship program, which was, it was called guardianship with Osage, but it was something that was widespread across Indian country. Native American people, a lot of us had money that we got from leasing out family lands or, for grazing, for natural gas, for mining, whatever it is. But across the board declared basically incompetent of handling our own finances and would need a white person to handle those for us. Osage had specifically the guardianship program, and as people figured out pretty quick, it's a lot more convenient to be married to your guardian. So there was a brief period of time where Molly, and it's said in there earlier, she dated Matt Smith for a while. So to me, I'm like, all right, Molly's smart, and she's also disabled. Molly had, even though type 2 diabetes very much afflicts our communities, Molly had type 1, which is very rare. She was indeed one of the first 5 people in the world to receive insulin. And she would have had to, in the first scene, she's talking about just like, itemizing with her guardian the money she's taking out to send to go pick up her medicine. That was another improv that I was happy with. They never cut, is sending my help. I wanted to get under Pitts Beatty's skin a little bit with that. But yeah, so Molly was dating white men. Ernest was one that I think she felt, this is one I can have fun with. He can do his thing, and he also will basically do what I tell him. And he was her guardian for a short amount of time before she figured out real quick he had no idea what he was doing, and she went back to her other guardian.
And I think Rita made the great point at the picnic. The whole dynamic is brilliant there, but that the uncle has money. He doesn't want your money. He loves you. So that
Exactly. I
want to ask you, because obviously you were comfortable enough to improvise, and you've talked a little bit about Martin's direction, but I wondered when we were watching the scene of the funeral, Anna's funeral, where she's in the casket. It's kind of a lot of this film is unimaginable circumstances. But I was wondering, with Marta's direction, how much freedom you felt to move. Did the camera follow you, or did you in these crazy emotional scenes have to hit marks and think about those technical things?
Anna the baby or Anna the sister?
Sorry, yes, I mean, both are terrible, but the sister,
right.
Yeah, the collapsing into Ernest's arms.
What was funny, Marty and he respected whatever it was that I needed to go through for each death, each sister, that he wouldn't ask what my plan was. A lot of times when we would block things out just for, focus pulling, just so they get like the general sense. But no, I wasn't. When it came to scenes like that particularly, I was never preoccupied with hitting marks. And Rodrigo and the entire camera team were they are definitely actors, cinematographers. They were very trained on what we were doing, and they spent so much time learning with us. And they were our first audience, really, and they're generous. They would react after, of course, not to ruin sound's job, but they would. So yeah, the moment with Anna, honestly, each time, I didn't fully know what the reaction was going to be to each sister, because it's such a different relationship with each one. It's such a different place that Molly's at within the Reign of Terror. A lot of it came from reading also A Pipe for February by Charles Redcorn, which outlines an Osage perspective of this period of time. Marty also optioned it. The first scene comes entirely from A Pipe for February. But yeah, for that scene, the reaction, specifically seeing Anna coming up from the bank, came from the way that it's drawn out in the book, because that came from a shared communal experience of how Molly was during that time. So that's the other thing, is Osage at this point had been removed from their homelands. There's this beautiful speech that Everett Waller improvised, the whole in the roundhouse when he's talking about, we never prayed for a good life, we just prayed for life. That's Everett being Everett. That's Everett being Paul Red Eagle. But that was initially Everett just vamping to get reactions from everybody before really quickly Bob told Marty to turn the camera around, and then that became his monologue in there. But that describes this whole period of time. Osage, even before we meet them, had already lost so much, had already, not entirely, but going through this period of time, burying the pipes and picking up a new way of life even before oil is struck. The whole boarding school generation, there was a draft at one point where Molly, you saw that she was a child in boarding school and had been taught English and had gone through this horrendous history. Yeah, there was a lot that Osage were carrying. So by the time that we meet them, it's, we talk about also undoing that trope of the stoic Indian, but it was also inappropriate to make an Osage woman, who everybody described, especially at that point, it's not stoicism, it's just, Osage have a saying that, like, I forget exactly how it goes, but basically, like, the river only goes forward, it doesn't go backwards. So you mourn, you have a period of intense mourning. That's what the wailing scene was about. It was an Osage practice that has kind of like gone away. But then once your mourning is done, you move on. So it was like not trying to make a melodrama out of this grief. It was like metering it all. Yeah, and what was cool was Marty knew that each one had to be different and would be different, and the whole team just accommodated for each one.
We are running out of time, but I have to ask you about tracking this illness when you went through the script, because you're being poisoned, you're addicted. I mean, it's a crazy journey that we watch you go on and then watch the FBI nurse you back to health. While it's a crazy juxtaposition in the film while Ernest's demise is happening. Can you just tell us about how you tracked the illness in all of those scenes?
That was also a very we would shoot multiple ways because there's so much mystery shrouded around this entire period of time. So really the big thing for me was deciding what she was getting. And from conversations with their other grandchild, Billy Burkhart, the family's pretty much determined that it was a combination of arsenic and morphine that was also in her insulin. So there were three things that I was processing in my body. And knowing, we would always say, like, okay, she's pregnant, and like that's the legacy of the family, so they're scaling back on the arsenic through the pregnancy, but it's still like Molly wasn't able to breastfeed, which is one reason the baby didn't have the immune system to fight off the whooping cough. So the arsenic, it ravages your central nervous system. The little tiny hand flips are all, that's part of it. So while arsenic is doing its horrendous job of eating her insides out and damaging every system in her body, she also has this process of becoming addicted to the morphine. So that's where I also put, we talked about this a bit beforehand, but there's so much subconscious in Molly that you have to craft, but you can't really play, because how do you play subconscious? You just allow it to be. But a lot of the suspicion that she would have had was arising from her instinctual subconscious place. Your conscious mind picks up the evidence that's put in front of you, and then your heart is ultimately the last thing that speaks. It's like there's no way that he would be capable of this. But the other added, blind spot that I gave her for Ernest was there was a physical addiction in this process too. Every time Ernest came around, suddenly things would feel a little bit better for a moment. And then as soon as the arsenic's gone, she starts getting better, because also the insulin is doing its job too. Once those elements are taken out of it, those last few scenes, I really, I've spent a lot of my life very close to people who are in different stages of relationships with their addictions. So that last period, those last few acts, particularly with Ernest, is like, this is a person breaking an addiction she doesn't know she has, but is applied onto basically her husband. So, as far as like the tuning of what she's getting more, sometimes less, other times, had a lot to do with how effective Ernest was at administering this. There's that beautiful scene that I think was found while we were making it, and was shot as an option, but pretty much we had decided on it that Ernest would give himself a little bit of whatever she's taking, which kind of further goes to prove that real love that the community kept saying that they had. The cocktail of all of the substances was where the subconscious mind that I gave Molly was able to start popping up a bit more, but her body's incapacitated at that point. And then the process of all of these things leaving her body, like without knowing it, her sobriety, her sober mind kind of like catching up. And I mean, some of you may have caught it in the hospital that she was also in the hospital prescribed heroin. So there's that. Thank you, 1920s healthcare.
I mean, there are so many scenes. It's just killing me that we're not going to have time to go through, like losing a child, that funeral scene, and the courthouse scene at the end, and the fight scene, and twice, she's giving him all of this opportunity to tell the truth. I just want to ask, because it sounds like you did alternates, and then we really are going to have to leave. It's when you actually saw the film, because you had filmed alternates, what were you surprised by? What were the surprises the first time you saw it?
I mean, there were some things that we had done early on that I thought maybe, I mean, those of us who have like seen our edited work later, a lot of times you realize the take that you felt like was the one was just your actor's take to get your own like, catharsis out of the way before you kind of settle into the nuance of your character. So, that aside, I had faith that it was there because it was felt. Early on, really it was just the first few months of production and one time where we had to skip ahead to the third act and shoot it in the first week because we tried to stay sequential to allow all of us to settle into and find what this dynamic would be, but production's production and moves the way that it does. But the thing that kind of kicked in after the first month was Marty works so closely with Thelma Schoonmaker. She's watching everything and she's giving notes during the whole process. So while we had kind of been doing these multiple takes of different levels of love, complicity, suspicion, and sometimes the relationship between Molly and Ernest when we were improvising would turn more antagonistic than loving. Thelma's notes were consistently, the love is what's working, more of that. So when we got to that point in the script, then that's when we're like, all right, we're just bending the rest and we're focusing on the love story because that's what's working. And that's what, as Margie Burkhart, Ernest and Molly's granddaughter, said when she watched the film, I mean, I think I maybe felt somewhat the same way, nowhere compared to what she would have felt. She said she felt a weight lifted, and she articulated something about how she was moved, or it was significant to her anyway, that she could see what maybe this relationship would have been.
You sold it. Ms. Lily Gladstone, thank you for spending so much time with us.